And we are live. I'm here today with Benny Lewis. I'm Shannon Kennedy, and we're going to be answering all of your questions about the Add1Challenge. We're just getting ready to launch the Add1Challenge 34. And so any questions at all that you have about participating in the challenge, about what's involved in the challenge, anything at all, we're more than happy to answer your questions. So Benny, I'll give you a moment to introduce yourself and chat a bit.
So, hey everybody, this is Benny. I founded Fluent in 3 months, and of course, I've been working with Brian to switch over to kind of take care of the Add1Challenge, which is perfectly aligned with my own projects that I had to learn languages over 3 months, and a community to inspire people to learn languages themselves. So as you guys are getting into your new language learning challenge, both Shannon and I would be very happy to take your questions, anything you're worried about as you start this off, and we will definitely help you. So as we're waiting for questions, I can give you guys some thoughts on various other projects that I've had over the last few years, and how I like to start things off. So like, for instance, when like I always tell people one of the biggest things you need to do as quickly as possible is embrace making mistakes. So remember that this is a challenge to improve your speaking ability above all else. And that means you're going to want to speak it as soon as you can. And you're going to want to get that practice. So no matter what you do, find ways to use the language. This is not a 3-month opening up your grammar book and doing those kinds of exercises. You know, you can, of course, have those kinds of projects, but the purpose of this community is that you're actually going to start using the language, and you will run into challenges. So don't expect everything's going to go so smoothly. It'll all be sunshine and rainbows. You know, you have to expect you're going to feel like you're making so many mistakes. You're going to feel dumb, and I have felt dumb in every single one of my language projects, and I've kind of overcome this slowly. And I still feel dumb even at the advanced level, but the whole point is that you just get more and more confident. So definitely want to give you guys permission to make those mistakes, because that's how you progress.
So we have a question about plateaus. One of our challengers, Rebecca, just completed Add1Challenge 33, and she's continuing on as a part of Add1 Advance in Add1Challenge 34, and she's feeling kind of stuck in a plateau. So what would your advice to her be?
Yeah, of course. So with plateaus, I've always found that I get stuck in plateaus because I'm doing the same thing over and over again and expecting things to improve. And so, for instance, I always tell people speak from day one. And this is not actually my language learning approach for all of my language levels. Speak from day one is how I get over my initial issues in the language, the initial confidence problems. But I'm not going to get to a fluent level by just speaking all the time, because I need to be able to hone my grammar at an intermediate stage. I need to be able to get feedback from a teacher or whatever it might be. So in short, you need to change your approach. So you're at that plateau because what you've been doing up to now has been very effective to get you where you are. So it doesn't mean you've done something wrong. What you've done has been great to get you here, but now you have to do something else. So this is why when I know I've reached an intermediate stage, no amount of just practicing speaking, because I'll bump into people or I might have a teacher, I'll have the same kind of conversations over and over again. That's not going to help me raise my language level. So at an intermediate stage, I personally would then actually open a grammar book and start doing those exercises. I'm not saying this is your solution, but I would say, what are your, you need to ask yourself really what your greatest weaknesses are right now, and what can you do that's very different to what you're currently doing to help you get over those weaknesses.
I want to kind of add to this just to get your feedback on it. So part of doing the Add1Challenge is that you're trusting in the system, that the day-to-day study routine that you've committed to is going to help you get through that plateau. And it might not feel like it when you are like in the moment, because it can feel like a bit of a drudgery when you're trying to, you know, commit to doing it daily when you're not feeling necessarily motivated to do it. So could you share a little bit of your experience? Have you ever been through that yourself, Benny?
So yeah, I think when, like, so for instance, when I've hopefully this touches on what you mean. When I was learning Mandarin, I found that and that was a very intensive period, because I know some people can be stuck at plateaus for months, but I was trying really, really hard to improve my skills and learning lots of vocabulary, maybe doing some tone work and for Mandarin in particular. And I didn't really feel after a few weeks that I was really making any genuine progress. And what I did to change that was and like have a talk with my teacher and have somebody else tell me what they think my biggest issues are. Because when we self-reflect, we just see so many problems. So when I asked another person, that my teacher said listening comprehension was my biggest issue, and that's why I moved on to tackling having I used listening to podcasts to kind of push my level up with my listening comprehension in that way. And it's what made the biggest difference for me, is getting someone else's feedback on figuring out how to get through that plateau, because no amount of doing what I was doing before was going to fix it, but just seeing you need to fix this problem and then thinking about how can I fix that problem. So I don't know if that addresses what you're saying, but it's kind of what.
So basically what you mean is when you feel as though you're in a bit of a plateau, maybe finding someone who can offer you feedback on where you're struggling the most, and then turning your attention to that one thing rather than trying to study across the board. And that'll kind of help you, more quickly experience improvement than when you're trying to kind of do everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because like maybe if your goal is still particularly conversations, you want to be practicing conversations ultimately. But if you do something like my previous example of fixing your listening comprehension, then that's going to help you have more complicated conversations. Whereas no amount of just speaking all the time is going to get you through that. So I think talking to somebody to see what is your specific problem, and that is a big issue with a lot of people. I think they spread themselves thin. They try to solve every single problem they have in the language. And I think focusing on particular issues is one of the greatest things people can do to move forward.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from Gavin. His first one is, Benny, having learned multiple languages, will you be imparting your vast experience to us all as a part of the challenge, given that there are a huge amount of resources out there which can be distracting? So he basically wants to know how you deal with the overwhelm of the number of resources that are out there and how you choose what you're going to work with.
Yeah, so this is very tricky, because I have fallen down the trap myself. No matter how much I recommend people to do it a particular way, I make this mistake myself, that I spend too much time researching exactly which one of these books is going to give me the best difference in learning kanji or learning whatever other feature of the language. And unfortunately, I spend so much time researching which is the best that I don't actually end up learning much of the language in that time. So it's very difficult to do this, especially if you're prone to perfectionism and you really want to use the absolute best resource. But I have, with time, accepted I just have to use something that's good. So never have your criteria that you absolutely must use the best resource possible, because there is too many. Like if you needed to use the best, you would have to spend vast amount of hours comparing reviews and all this kind of stuff. So generally, when I start any of my projects, I do a little bit of research, and whatever seems to be coming out on top, whatever I like the look of, like I just try to do a kind of Pareto principle of 80-20, just putting a little bit of effort to see, like, is this going to be like in the top 80% of courses? Maybe there's another one out there that's going to be better for me for fixing this, like some other resource fixing this problem. But ultimately, you have a certain payoff, that the more time you put into trying to research exactly the best research out of all of them, the worse you're going to be off from not having just learned the language. And I have actually been glad, even when years later I'll see, oh, wow, this book is actually way better than the one I used. I have been really glad that I put the effort into learning using a resource that was just quite good, because I went beyond that resource. You know, anything that is good enough, that's what you need. So don't spend too much time looking at all the resources. Just try to cut it down to something good enough. If you're quite happy with it, stop there, use that, and move forward.
There's two things that I'd like to add to this answer as well, particular to the Add1Challenge. One is that one of the great things about being a part of a community is that you have other people in the group trying other resources. So you'll be in a mastermind and a study group so that you are able to kind of exchange notes on what you think is working, what's not, what you think is a quality resource and what is not. So having that system in place is a great way to kind of find out what you could be using or what you should be using. The other thing is that I am the Add1 community manager. So if you have any questions at all about what resources to use, what's going to work best for your study style, where you're at with your learning, all you have to do is direct message me on Slack, and I am more than happy to work with you to figure out what would be the best fit. So I am very happy to do that. Do not be afraid to send me a message if that is something that you're concerned about what you should be using. We had Lisa who said, I'm 60 and I'm worried that I'm too old. Have you seen other older learners succeed? So before you get to this, Benny, I just want to say in the last Add1Challenge, we had an older learner. Her name is Nikki, and she's learned several languages as a part of the Add1Challenge. And I have not yet seen her not get to that 15-minute conversation in the Add1Challenge. We have other learners that are over 50, and I see them do really wonderfully in the challenge. So yes, it is totally possible, Lisa, for you to learn a language and succeed in the Add1Challenge. Age is not a factor in learning a language. Benny, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so like the fact that this community doesn't really have a particular age it trends towards means you should see that you're not going to be alone no matter what age group you find yourself in. But in general, from just learning languages among people all over the world, what I've seen is a lot of things that people think matter more are not as important. Like natural talent, when I think back on my school days, a lot of people in my class did significantly better than I did at German. And yet, if I met them in person now, my German would be way better than theirs. So even though they have that natural talent, natural academic sense, that's not giving them the advantage. And when I think of people much younger than me who get into languages, a lot of teenagers who can start language learning right now, I can definitely still do better than a lot of them for a lot of reasons, but they're still younger than me. And in general, I found that no matter what your challenge is, what you think might be holding you back, whether it's age or natural talent, you can find that this is not actually as big an issue as you think it is. So there are a lot of people of a lot of ages who are learning languages all the time. And I would say right now, I'm 36 tomorrow is going to be my birthday, and I think I am a much better language learner at 36 than I was as a 20-year-old from the techniques I've learned. And I don't expect when I'm 60 to be any different to how I am now. So don't think age is a problem. There's never a better time to learn language than now.
Happy birthday. Mark asks, what are your thoughts on how to balance working with tutors on italki versus a language exchange partner? He looked at some of the rates for some of the recommended French tutors, and even some of the community tutors are still $25 an hour versus the $35 to $40 for a professional teacher. That adds up fast. So he says it seems valuable, but he doesn't want to break the bank. So what would you suggest?
Well, firstly, one thing a lot of people forget when it comes to finding paid teachers is I think when people do a search on a site like italki, they tend to look for French teachers from France. And that makes sense, especially if you're ultimately deciding you want to move to France or you want to learn Parisian French. But there are a lot of native speakers, community and otherwise, who can help you from other countries. And I found if you expand your search and you have some North African countries who do have native French speakers, you'll find them to be a lot more affordable. So that's the first thing, is to expand beyond France, because remember, you are paying people, if you're a private teacher, you're paying people who live in a city like Paris, which is expensive. So they need to be able to afford an hourly wage that covers that. But if you're going to a cheaper country, like anyone learning Spanish, I always recommend they get Latin American teachers, even if they want to go to Spain. And you could still have a French teacher, like maybe once every week or 2 weeks, and then have your main teacher helps you with the biggest issues. And then the second thing I would say is, if you're still finding difficulty, then expand your search to non-native speakers, because there are a lot of very, very skilled teachers in languages like French who just happen to not be natives, but they'll have a C2 level. They will be a little modest, and they're essentially like what most of us would think to be natives, but they just don't want to say that. And they're still very happy to teach the language. And in many ways, it's actually a little bit easier to learn from someone who has learned French as a second language. And I learned a lot of my Spanish when I first learned it from non-native Spanish speakers. So that's what I would say in terms of finding a more affordable teachers, expanding your reach that way. And in terms of balancing between that and private exchanges, I would say that's mostly a question of your budget, because if you can afford it, especially if you've expanded enough that you start seeing people at $10 an hour and you know you can put that investment in, then great. But if you still see, okay, you've reached your limit here, then I'm going to switch to private exchanges with people. You can definitely get a lot out of that. It's great practice. It just means that person may be less skilled or less likely to correct you, or less likely to lead you in a direction, even if they're not correcting you, to make the conversation a little bit easier. It always depends on the person. You may be very lucky and find a language exchange that's exceptional and like helps you so much. And I just think it's more likely with a teacher whose 100% goal is to help you. Whereas a language exchange, remember, they're going to want to switch back to your native language at some stage. So if you can afford it, then try to get that teacher. If you can't afford it, then test out a lot of different people. And this is one thing with the site like italki, with both teachers or language exchanges. Don't just pick the first one or two. The first few weeks of my language learning projects, I actually intentionally try a bunch of teachers and pick my favorite one or two and stick with them.
Okay. Gavin also asked, how essential is it to learning all of the language's grammar to be conversational in a language, as grammar can be both difficult and boring to learn as far as all the rules by heart?
Okay. So this is kind of a controversial thing. You'll get different answers from different people. My personal opinion here is that as a beginner in languages, you should actually be ignoring the grammar as much as possible, because it's going to hinder your ability to communicate. There's going to be too many rules that you're going to try and figure your way around. Whereas if you learn a set phrase, then you can express what you need to express with that phrase. And then if you say what you need to say with incorrect grammar, then if your goal as a beginner is communication, you're going to succeed in that goal. If I said to you, supermarket where, that's not a grammatically correct sentence, but you know what I mean, and the conversation can move forward. As an intermediate learner, that's when I would say grammar becomes a bit more essential, because you can already communicate, and it starts to become your biggest issue that you're communicating, but it's kind of messy. And as a beginner, I think the messiness of your communication is way less of a priority. So I would kind of push grammar till later. And on top of that, you said it was boring. And I would agree that as a beginner, it's just so boring seeing all these rules. But something has changed for me dramatically when I learn languages and I get enough through the communication stage that I reach that intermediate stage. I'm the kind of person who would just fall asleep in class whenever my teacher would talk grammar to me. And yet, nowadays, I actually enjoy learning grammar as an intermediate learner, because I'm filling in gaps that have context for me. Whereas if I tell you a grammar rule of a language you've just started, then that's just a rule. It's boring. It's not relevant to you. It's not about speaking the language. It's not a new word. Whereas if you can already speak the language to a certain degree, then that grammar rule, you suddenly be like, oh, that's why they say it that way. And I really, I start to enjoy it more. I think grammar becomes more enjoyable when it's more relevant to you.
Okay, so Sohi asks, when practicing conversation skills with a native speaker, what are your thoughts on practicing with one who does versus does not have language teaching experience?
Okay, so when you're practicing with someone who does have language teaching experience, you want to give them more of the control, because one reason I like to pay for teachers is because that's one less thing that I have to do. When I'm having a conversation, I just want to be thinking about what do I need to say, and I don't want to worry about anything else. And with a teacher, I feel like they're going to see where my weaknesses lie, and they're going to take control and move the conversation in the right direction. So I just have to kind of be a passenger, as it were. But with a conversation partner, when they don't have experience as a teacher, then that puts a bit more pressure on me, and I have to accept that. Or even when I'm using the language out with people in general, and it's not an exchange situation, I still have more responsibility to guide the conversation in the right direction. So I have to take more control. I have to tell the person, today I'd like to talk about colors, or today I'd like to talk about this aspect. Whatever the thing you need to decide is, you need to take a lot more control. You can't just start a call with a conversation exchange partner and see where it goes, because that's got no real direction. So you need to decide ahead of time, today I'd really like us to talk about this. Whereas with a teacher, it's not as tiring because you're just doing what they're telling you to talk about, ideally. So that's what I would say the major differences are.
All right. Baron asks, what if we already have learned a language that others are learning? Will we be able to give them advice?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you meet anybody who is a higher level than you, they can always impart wisdom to you, and vice versa. And as I was saying a minute or two ago, I met a lot of people who were native French speakers, German speakers, Italian speakers, and they were the ones who helped me most with my Spanish. And they were not they were definitely not at the native level. They weren't even at the advanced level. They were just intermediate, but they were still higher level than me, and they could correct me if I needed corrections, and they could answer my questions like, how do I say this in Spanish? And I think anyone who is a level higher than you can definitely help you, and anyone who's a level lower than you, you can definitely give them some advice, to a limit. Like, you want to be confident in what you're talking about. If you really know this rule, tell them. But if you're not that sure and you're kind of think, oh, I still need to learn that, then don't lead them astray, because that's not going to help them ultimately.
I also find that sometimes teaching something helps you master it better yourself. So when you actually have to sit down and think about something that you know and figure out how to explain it, it helps you better instill that knowledge yourself.
Definitely, yeah. And like me, I've been an English teacher, and I think if before that you had asked me what's the difference between I ate and I have eaten, there's just no way I would have been able to explain that. Like, to me, it's just like, well, one's right in some situations and wrong in others, and that's all I had for you. But by teaching it to people, I have found I really have to deconstruct it, and that helps me in a lot of ways, including the language that I have learned as a second language. So definitely agree with you.
He also asks, when I'm doing conversation practice, do I want the other person to correct me all the time?
So this for me is similar to the grammar question, that as a beginner, again, your priority is communication. So if you are definitely going to make mistakes, and I think the biggest mistakes is where you'll want corrections from, and they tend to be just using the right word. So you want to get corrections if you, I don't know, if you say you want to rent a car, and then the word for car instead you say banana, that's the kind of thing you really do want to get corrected on. But if you say, I want car to rent, and you got the word order wrong, then you don't really need corrections on that as a beginner, because that's not your biggest problem. The biggest problem is just speaking, getting that confidence, getting the momentum. So I would, as a beginner, recommend you just get corrections on the key words that you're not getting right, and try to communicate that to the person you're talking to. Then at the intermediate stage, the further higher you go, the more you want corrections on everything that you're saying, because as an upper intermediate, I want to know what are the grammar mistakes I'm making, what's the little subtle differences in what I'm saying that I should be saying. So definitely depends on your level.
So since we've mentioned the intermediate level a couple of times at this point, I think it's good to note something that we just announced recently. We actually have an intermediate version of the Add1Challenge. So for those of you who have completed an Add1Challenge, you qualify to participate in the intermediate challenge. And I think that's really exciting. It's a really great way to get your language to the next level. The challenges are completely different. The assignments are different. It's a lot more intensive, and it's a really good way to take your language to the more advanced level after you've completed your first challenge as a beginner. Susie asks, what advice can you give someone who does not have a study group with people learning the same language as a part of the Add1Challenge?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. So there are lots of different things that you can do. The first is, again, feel free to chat with me. Even if I haven't learned that language in particular, I have come across a lot of resources, and I know other learners that I can connect with and see if I can help out as far as finding resources or making recommendations. There's also the Facebook group, so we can reach out to people who have learned that language in the past on your behalf and see if we can help you find someone that you can chat with, maybe not necessarily in the active challenge, but as a part of the greater Add1Challenge community. And beyond that, just because there's not someone learning the same language within the challenge doesn't mean that there aren't other people learning that language altogether. So you can also connect with other learners and exchange partners through platforms like italki and HelloTalk. So there are ways to connect with native speakers and other learners of the language, even if it's not necessarily within the Add1Challenge itself. Do you have anything that you want to add?
No, you've covered everything I would have said, just that they need to expand the amount of people they may be talking to, because you'll always find other learners, definitely.
All right. Gabriella asks, Benny, do you think that your line of books, Language Hacking, is adequate for the way the Add1Challenge is designed?
I definitely do, because one of the things that we were most proud of in the Language Hacking books is that we made it about conversation. We really did, and then at the end of each unit, we push people, and like this is so counterintuitive in a lot of ways, but my biggest goal with my book was to get people away from my book, to get them to close the book, to walk over and use what they've learned with another person. And I think you'll find we really push that. We don't push grammar very much because we consider it to be beginners conversation book, and then leaving intermediate for other books the teacher set does. So I definitely think it'll align very well with the Add1Challenge.
I have to add that in the last challenge, there were several learners using it for the different languages, and it did work really, really well because, again, as Benny said, it's conversation-based, so it helps you get that confidence using the language and speaking the language right away, which just goes really, really well with the Add1Challenge. One of the other things that I wanted to add about grammar is that for me, my approach, having participated in a few Add1Challenges myself, is that I learn it on an as-needs basis. So rather than following a course book that says I need to know this grammar point at this stage of my learning, I kind of try to use the language as much as possible. And if something grammar-wise comes up, I decide that I probably need that because it came up in the natural context of using the language. And so then I'll take a moment to learn that thing, but I don't learn grammar unless I need it. So I find that that strategy helps quite a bit as far as how to approach grammar during the Add1Challenge in particular. Gavin also asks, would you say proper pronunciation of your target language helps with confidence when it comes to conversation?
So pronunciation is another one of these things that I would say is actually not as high as, like, depending on your goals. I'd say it's almost the same as grammar in terms of how urgent you need to get this exactly right. You need to have your pronunciation intelligible. Like if you're saying things completely differently, they're not going to understand you. But if you have an accent, that's fine. That's not something that needs to be urgent. And you'll actually find, and this is really directly with your confidence question, you'll find that people find it charming if you're trying to learn the language and you're making a few mistakes and you have this accent. Believe it or not, you might in your head be thinking, everyone's laughing at me. Everyone thinks I'm an idiot. But really, they think they might appreciate your effort, and the accent shows you're still a learner, and they know that, and it actually helps your cause a little bit. So I would definitely not say it's something you need to stress about. If people are understanding you, that's great. The accent can be something you polish up later on in your language learning journey.
All right. Daryl asks, have you ever tried using Tandem for language exchanges? I'm assuming he means the application in particular. Do you have any experience with Tandem?
I don't have experience with the Tandem app, and I've done tandems, but that's essentially the conversation exchange that we were talking about before. So I haven't used Tandem, unfortunately, myself.
Okay. So he also asks, how would you define being fluent in a language? Well, of course, everyone has different definitions and thoughts. What would you say? Like, when would you say I am fluent in X language?
I would say very simply when I am socially equivalent to how I would be in my mother tongue. So what that means is the ways I tend to use English in social situations is maybe I'm at a friend's party at his house and we're just talking about life in the city and how expensive something is. And that kind of level of conversation, that essentially I can have that same level in my target language without it being like obstructed by my language limitations. So it's flowing. And that means I might still be making a couple of grammar mistakes, but not enough that stop them in their tracks and they have to think, what's he talking about? Or that make it sound really difficult to listen to. Like it's understandable, but it's really like sounds like Yoda speaking or something. So I would say if your conversation is flowing in social situations, then you are fluent. That doesn't mean you're finished. There's a whole mastery stage that you can function professionally like you would in your mother tongue. That's the next stage, but that's not as necessary for most people and most goals. That's why I say fluency is the social equivalency level.
In my experience, there's different kinds of fluency, so it all depends on what situation you are trying to use the language, because that's going to determine what your definition of fluency is. For me, the way that I kind of judge it for myself personally is if I can understand a conversation on the phone where the signal might not always be super great, I don't have any visual cues, I lose a lot of the context that you lose with face-to-face conversation, or just like digital face-to-face conversation. If I can get through a conversation on the phone in a language, I feel like I've kind of arrived. So that's the way that I measure it personally. Mark says, I found I can take the French B2 DELF test in my city in December. I'm probably around a B1 right now. Does working towards taking that during the Add1Challenge seem like a reasonable goal?
Okay, if you're at a B1 and you want to do a B2 during the Add1Challenge, I think it's a reasonable goal, but it's the kind of thing that I would only say is reasonable if you are really able to invest a lot of your time into it. Because going up a notch in a language, this isn't something, so like different people put different emphasis into their Add1Challenges. Some people may only put a few hours a week. Some people are like really devoted. It's their big summer project. And I think the latter case, it is realistic that you can go up a notch in the European Common Framework scale. But if you're not, like if you're very busy this summer, you're working a lot and it's only something you're doing a few hours a day, it's not as realistic. But if you say you've got your test in December, then I would say maybe in this Add1Challenge, try to focus on just one aspect of the exam, like your spoken aspect or your listening aspect, whatever it might be. And then when your Add1Challenge ends, spend the next months working on the other aspects of the exam.
Adrian says, I find accents a problem as a learner. I have a friend from Galicia and struggle to understand them in English. Does it sound better in Spanish as it is more natural? Is it just a strong accent? Thanks. So I guess this question is perhaps dealing with accents within a language. So like different dialects or different pronunciations of different languages, like perhaps the difference between Latin American Spanish and Spain Spanish.
Yeah, and I like with Spanish in particular, I ran into this myself, that people from Spain, as they spoke to me, I just couldn't understand it. Whereas when people from Latin America, the likes of Colombia, and as I mentioned, the other non-native speakers, when they spoke to me, I could suddenly have a conversation. And it's not something to feel too bad about. Some accents are just a little bit more difficult for learners than others. And it's kind of on top of you still trying to just learn the language. So if it's possible, try to speak more with people who don't have as difficult an accent, and that'll help you get around the actual language issues. And once you're confident with that, then adjust to that accent. And I try to have my dialect work after I've had my base language work. And now I can understand any Spaniard who speaks to me just as easily as I would understand a Latin American who speaks to me. But it's mostly because I actually avoided speaking to Spaniards for the most part, even while I was living in Spain, just until I was confident enough to start speaking to them. So you need to work on your base skills before you get to more advanced dialects, I would say.
Julius asks, out of curiosity, why is it that in America we don't learn more languages growing up and tend to just stick with English, but in other places it's common to learn 2 or more languages?
Well, I would say it's very simply because the United States is a very, very big country, and you can travel within the States to see mountains, and you can go skiing, you can have lakes, you can have oceans, whereas in Ireland, if I want to get some kind of difference, or like, let's say mainland Europe, if you want to get some kind of difference in your environment and you want to go on a holiday, then you travel a few hundreds of miles or kilometers, and you're in a completely different country. And that's the thing, is it's so small, you're surrounded by all these different languages, so it just makes more sense to learn those different languages. There are also cultural and historical things. The fact that English in particular has made its way into becoming like the international language of business means that there's less motivation for English speakers from any country. So even in the UK, which is closer to Europe, they're still not as likely to learn other languages just because other people tend to learn English. And this is very unfortunate, but it's just a case of the English being this more international language. But once you go to those countries and you start speaking to them in their own language, they definitely appreciate it. Even more so. People have been even more glad when I try to speak their language because I'm a native English speaker. They see I'm being extra not lazy because I could just go around speaking English all the time if I wanted to. And I'd be limiting myself to the rich touristy areas, of course, but I still could technically do that. So they appreciate it even more. So I would say that as an added point to it.
Rasmus asks, I want to study it on a basis of a target language at the university. I'm wondering when I should jump into learning academic vocabulary. I don't think that reaching B2 or C1 will be enough.
Okay, so study on a basis of a target language. So I don't know if that means study like his course through the target language. Generally, it depends. Like I think some courses may involve less language skills, and then it's more using the language to kind of use your hands or something else like that, where some are very much centered around the language. So for instance, engineering is, there are certain things I can't do with engineering between languages, but the thing is, a lot of the vocabulary is Latin. So I kind of have a heads up over someone who, for instance, does literature in university. I think their job of going through university is going to be way more complicated than mine, because I might see a Spanish or French word and kind of know what it means, because generally scientific terms are the same across English and Latin languages. And so it really depends on your field. Generally, like for me, I think when I reached the C1 level, I would have been confident enough to study engineering, but I wouldn't have been confident enough to study other subjects, even if I was like very familiar with those subjects.
Laura asks, can you recommend any good online website tests to unofficially gauge your CEFR level? I'm going to take this one really quick. We actually have a couple posts on Fluent in 3 months specifically about this topic, and I did write one on the website where I list places that you can take a mock exam online to gauge your level, so I will send those to you in Slack. Jonathan says, it seems like a lot of us in the Add1Challenge are learning our target language without any prior experience. What is your process for learning a language that when you don't have any prior experience?
Yeah, this is a very big question because it's essentially how you're starting off the whole language learning process. But essentially, as quickly as I can, I would say you got to, if you're starting from absolute scratch, have an immediate goal of your first conversation and try to get there. And the ways you get there, there's many ways, but for me personally, I would try to learn a few phrases and to then, as quickly as possible, use those phrases with another person. And when I do that, that other person is going to show me there's so many things I don't know, and I'm going to see from that what's the next thing I need to focus on. And I try to have a dynamic learning approach. So rather than saying, follow these 17 steps, and then this is what you got to do from day one, I try to push people in the direction of seeing what are you finding harder, what are the barriers preventing you from having basic conversations, and try to focus on those barriers and go right back as quickly as possible to have another conversation so you can be sure it's still your biggest problem. Because otherwise you might decide at the beginning, vocabulary is my biggest problem, and spend 3 months learning lists of vocabulary. Then that's not the best way to do this. You want to keep kind of constantly gauging where you are and what you need to work on.
I think this would also be a good time to kind of talk a bit about your strategies for scripting.
Yeah, so for instance, when I would have my 3-month projects, one aspect that was very useful for me was to like record a video once every week or two. And I would have this script I would try to follow of predictable conversations that I would have like either on camera or I would be using out and about with people. So if I tend to have the first conversation I would have when I meet people is about who I am. So I would just pre-write that conversation because it comes up so often. That means in the moment, I don't have to keep thinking, oh, how did I say I studied engineering again? I would just have that phrase as part of my script and I would learn it ahead of time. And people are surprised by how many conversations are a bit more predictable. So you can do this in the combination of, like I did, making videos that you're following a script, or you can know the kind of things you're likely to talk about and try to apply those scripts to memory. So if someone asks you, why are you learning French? You can just go on talking for 30 seconds and it really gets your confidence up, your momentum up, even if you're not necessarily understanding every aspect. So try to like run it through a native speaker so you can be sure these words are the right words to use. But then you have a ready-made answer to go at the drop of a hat.
All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. If you have any other questions that we didn't get to as a part of today's discussion, please feel free to leave them in the questions thread on Slack, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Other than that, Benny, do you have any last encouraging words you'd like to offer our new Add1Challengers?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that just use this Q&A as your initial inspiration and definitely ask more questions in the Slack group because that's what this is all about. We're a community to help each other learn the languages. So if you have other doubts, ask them. And the number one thing I want to always people to take away is you have permission to make mistakes. So get out there, use the language, and you'll slip up, and that's part of the process. Does not mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing it right.
Yeah, definitely don't be afraid to ask your questions. If you have any concerns, doubts, or questions, there's a good chance that someone else will have those same questions. So, you know, just as part of the community experience, don't be afraid to ask them because, you know, everyone will benefit from them being asked and having that answer. So I look forward to learning with all of you as part of this Add1Challenge, and I will see you inside Slack. So thank you, Benny, and thank you everyone for watching.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and best of luck in the Add1Challenge.